Hey, this is Connor with CongruentX, and today we're going to be talking about Power Automate. So today we're going to talk about how do I automate things on the Power Platform. We're going to do that using Power Automate. We're going to talk about triggers, actions, conditions, how to use functions within Power Automate, and we'll talk about the connections you'll be using in your flows. Let's jump right into it. All right, let's talk about how to create a flow. So from make.powerapps, there's two different ways you can do this. You can either go directly to powerautomate.com or flow.microsoft.com, or you can do this from the maker experience. So on this left side, you'll see an area called flows. There's a lot of out-of-the-box templates that we could use to get us started or maybe do exactly what we want. But for today, we're gonna start from scratch. So to do that, we're gonna hit New Flow, and we can click one of these three options: Automated, Instant, or Scheduled. For now, I'm gonna click Automated, and you can either search for a trigger here to start with, or we can skip it and just start with a totally blank flow. That's what we're gonna do here. So now that we have a flow created, there are two main sections in the UI here we need to take a look at. This top section is a list of all the connectors. You can organize or kind of filter them using these buttons above. And then below, we have all the triggers and actions that apply to those connectors. So if I select Microsoft Dataverse, we then see the triggers and actions available for that connection. So since our flow is blank, we have to start with a trigger. There are three types of triggers when it comes to Power Automate. There are instant, scheduled, and conditional or automated. An instant flow is something that the user manually, so it's going to be a button in the model-driven UI, or it could be in a Power App, or it could be pressing a button in the Power Automate phone app. A scheduled trigger is exactly what it sounds like. It just makes the flow run on a schedule. So that could be once a day on weekdays, or it could be every 15 minutes, whatever fits your use case. And last, we have the automated or conditional trigger. That just means when a certain condition is met, the flow is going to trigger. So let's start with a conditional or automated trigger. The most common use cases for a flow is to trigger something when a record is added, deleted, or updated in your database. So in our case, we're going to open Microsoft Dataverse, and we're going to select the when a row is added, modified, or deleted trigger. So every action and every trigger has a set of parameters, and a lot of them have extra advanced options as well that you can expand. In our case, let's say we want to trigger this flow when a record is added. So we're going to say when a row is added. We tell it which table this applies to. So in our case, let's say it's accounts, and we have to select the scope. This means which users can actually trigger this flow. For most people, using the organization scope is going to make the most sense. Let's talk about scheduled triggers. So if we just type in schedule, we can get the schedule or recurrence trigger. So there's some simple configuration we can do here. We can select the frequency and the interval. Let's say we want this to run once a day. And if we want to specify when to run, we can say, okay, we want this to run at 1 o'clock. This is based on 24 hours in a day. So 0 would be 12 a.m., 1 a.m., 2 a.m. And then you could even specify the minutes. If you are going to get that granular, I would suggest selecting your time zone, because by default, it's going to use UTC. Finally, let's talk about instant triggers. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. The main ways are the flow button for mobile, which is the Power Automate app for the phone. You can manually trigger a flow in Power Apps, so in a Canvas app, or you can manually trigger a flow from a model app. Let's just start simply with the flow button for mobile, manually trigger a flow. So all this means is that the user has to manually trigger the flow. Nothing automated or conditional or scheduled is going to happen. All right, let's talk about actions. There are a ton of actions. For every connector, there's usually at least 3 to 5 actions. In our case, let's set up a flow that will go do a query to our database. So we have our manual trigger. And in our case, we're using Dataverse as our database. And let's look at actions. You can see there's a ton of actions we can do here. For now, we're gonna use list rows. And that's gonna do exactly what it sounds like. It's gonna list rows that meet certain criteria. So the only required parameter here is to select the table. In our case, let's use accounts. So there's two things we're going to use here. We're going to use select columns and we're going to use filter rows. Select columns means we're telling it which columns to return, because we probably don't want the entire width of the table. And we're going to use a filter to get a specific list of rows or records. So the syntax for this is a little funky. I'll leave the documentation down below, but there is a specific kind of syntax that you have to use in this parameter. Okay, so looking at our data here, let's say we want to pull accounts where the city is equal to Redmond. So we see address 1 city, that's the display name of the column. So we need the schema name of that column. Address 1 city. The actual schema name for this column is address1 underscore city. So I'm going to copy that and paste that in here. And the syntax here is going to be the column EQ. And in our case, since we're using a string, we need to put 2 quotes surrounding our string. Let's go and select our columns as well. And this is just going to be a kind of CSV style of all the commas that you want to retrieve in this query. So we're probably going to want city. Let's say we probably also want state. So I'm going to copy that over. We're going to want the account ID, and let's pull the name in. Name is just name. And let's go ahead and save our flow, and then we can test it. In this top right, you'll see test. If there's any problems with your flow, you should see that here in the flow checker. There's 2 ways to test your flow. There is manually and automatically. When you automatically test your flow, you can actually point at previous runs and rerun that run of your flow. In our case, we're just gonna hit manual. We can see our flow ran successfully. And if we expand our options here, we can see the results. We can see the inputs and the outputs of each trigger and action. So most of these responses are going to be in JSON. So if we click to download, copy and paste, I'm going to open a simple JSON formatter just so we can look at this a little easier. But here on the right side, you can see our response. We get City Power and Light, we get Contoso, Pharmaceuticals, Adatum, and Microsoft. So let's use a different action and we'll talk about conditionals. Let's use get row by ID. And all this means is you're using the GUID to pull a specific record. And we can actually use our previous response to grab that GUID. All right, so let's enter our GUID. Let's surround it in quotes and test our flow. And you'll see that our flow is gonna fail. And let's look at why. We can look at the error, action failed, and we get a little bit of information in this error details. In our case, I just know you're not supposed to include the quotations, so we'll get rid of that. I just wanted to show you how the error looked. So let's go ahead and get rid of those, run the flow, and we get our record. So let's say based on this record, we want to do different things in the app. That's where conditional actions come into play. This is going to be grouped under a connection called control. So you can see we have condition, apply to each, and a couple other options here. Let's focus on condition. So this is just a really simple way to have some if-then logic. This is also going to introduce us into dynamic content. Most triggers and most actions are going to return some sort of output from them. In our case, we can see the get row by ID action has the following responses. And because we didn't select any columns, we're getting everything back. And we can also see that the manually trigger a flow, the trigger, in some cases, that trigger can return the address of the triggering user, the city, the state, the latitude, longitude, that kind of stuff. In our case, let's say if the city equals Redmond, we're gonna do something. So I'm gonna search for city. Let's select address 1 city is equal to, you do not have to use quotes here. And let's go ahead and run our flow. And you can see the result was true. So the city of the account we returned did equal Redmond. All right, let's talk about variables. Variables are a really important part of Power Automate because they make your flow more dynamic and it makes things easier to reference throughout your app. So in Power Automate, you have to start by initializing the variable and then you set it later in the flow. So we're going to initialize variable. We're going to give it a name. Say variable 1, and we tell it what type of variable. In our case, let's say it's a string. And we can give it an initial value if that makes sense to do. So let's go back to our list accounts step. So to use our get a row by ID example we did a second ago, let's open the set variable action. We're gonna select the variable, which is var1. Let's say we wanna set it to the name of the account. all we do is select account name. Let's go ahead and test that and make sure it works. And there we go. If we look at the output of the variable, we can see it says Adatum Corporation. So to expand on that a little bit and introduce one more control, let's go back to our list accounts example. So one of the most common things you're going to do in Power Automate is take a list of items or a table and iterate per row. So for each row in this thing, in this table, in this response, I want to do something. So to do that, we're going to add a step called apply to each, and that's under the controls. It's called apply to each. We're going to go to our dynamic content, and we're going to see value and body. The other responses returned from the list rows are fields from our response. But what we want is we want the actual list of items that this query returned. So if we go back and look at our JSON, we can see we have the body, and then inside the body, we have this value section that is returning each of our rows. So let's do two things here. Let's set a variable that's going to be the account name for each account that's returned. And let's also increment a variable. Let's say this is var name. It's going to be a string. We're not going to give it an initial value. We can actually copy and paste this step as well to do things a little bit faster. So we go to copy. Let's click add my clipboard, and we see we have our init var name step here. So let's change the name to var count. We're going to make this an integer, and we're going to start it at 0. This is going to count how many things are returned from our step. So now that I'm inside my apply to each, for each row, I want to set my name variable. Now keep in mind, this is going to be overwritten for each iteration, but it's good to see in the flow run itself. So we'll set that to var name, and we have to tell the variable what value to take. And because we're in the context of an apply to each, we can select a field name. So in our case, we're going to select account name. So essentially what we have here is we're saying, okay, for each account whose city equals Redmond, we're going to set the var name variable to the name of the account. And we're also going to increment our variable to count how many accounts are in there. So this action is named a little different. It's called increment variable. I'm going to rename this to increment var count. And we're going to tell it which variable, which is var count, and increment add, we're just going to add 1. So let's go ahead and run this so we can visualize how this looks. All right, if we open up our flow run, we can actually see each step that was applied. So you see if I hit next, we're on the second run, now we're on the third run, and we're on the fourth. If we take a look at our increment variable, you can see we started here at 0. We entered the first run, which incremented to 1, then to 2, then to 3, and to 4. So we know 4 accounts got returned from the list rows action. So the last thing I'll leave you with here is there's actually an easier way to figure out how many items are in a table or an array. There are actions that can do things, and there are also functions you can use within actions to do things. Now I'm going to introduce the compose step here. The compose step is kind of like a variable, except you don't initialize it. I use this step a lot to kind of debug things as I'm building. Power Automate calls this expressions, and I'll leave a link to this down below. There's documentation on all the available expressions. There's a function called length, and you can see here under collection, we see length. And inside the parentheses, it only asks for one parameter, which is the array. And we can actually switch over to our dynamic content to select this. And you'll see it spits out this funky syntax, which I've never bothered to memorize. You don't need to worry about it because it will write it for you. If we hit OK, it's going to add our expression to our action. If we run our flow, we'll see what that looks like. So you can see here, it returned 4. Another thing to mention here is rearranging steps. If you find that you've put things out of order, you can drag and drop actions to change the order. And I know this is a lot, but the last thing I'll mention is managing your flow. So if we go back to make.powerapps and we go to flows, we can see here's our flow that we created. If I click on this, it shows me a history of all the flow runs. And I can actually dive into any of those historical flow runs and see what happened. Thanks so much, everybody, for watching the Intro to Power Apps series. I know I threw a lot at you today, but I hope this gave you at least a rough idea of what Power Automate is and what all it can do. As always, if you have any questions, reach out to us at congruentx.com. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next one.